Drew, let's start with you. You're from Ohio.
Correct.
How in the world and why in the world are you in Louisiana, and what's your fascination or your obsession with Pete Maravich and this movie that you've been working on for, I think, 9 years? Mm-hmm. You want to talk a little bit about that and how that segues into you meeting John Musemeche?
Sure.
And then where we at right now?
Sure. So in October of 2014, I moved to Baton Rouge to work in the film industry from Columbus, Ohio. And I'd already begun writing the script for a feature film on Pete Maravich. And so I moved here in October, and the first week that I was here, I went to go visit LSU. And while I was at LSU, I was looking at the display they had on Pete Maravich and found John's name in there and his company's name, Musemeche Photography.
Through all the photos.
Yes. And so I looked it up online, and then I called Musemeche Photography, and, I was like, is this the same John Musemeche that took these photos of Pete Maravich? And they were like, yeah. So I drove over there. And
they're classic photos.
Yes. And so I drove over to his place of business, and he wasn't there. But then right after that, he called me back. I left him a message, and we ended up grabbing lunch. And that's how I met John. That was the first week that I was in Louisiana.
So he's obviously helpful in your movie preparation for the screenplay, which I understand is finished now, the writing part of it.
Yes.
Where did this idea for the documentary come about? And then we're going to talk to John.
Sure. Well, over time, because, again, this was 2014, so I've lived here for almost 9 years. Next month it'll be 9 years. And so over that time, John and I had gotten together after that. And then eventually we would kind of hang out at his house on a Sunday night, eat some pizza, and talk. So I kept hearing all these really great stories about Pete Maravich, Pistol Pete. And so,
stories you had never heard before, stories that made more sense that you had heard before, added value to it, so to speak.
And, well, because John was there, he was there. And so, and we just, would spend time together. He'd tell me stories about Pete and other stories. And just the more I heard about it over the years, it wasn't something initially, it wasn't like an idea that I planned out. But over the years, and having started the script and then finished the screenplay for a feature film, I wanted to do something shorter because you can't just jump into a big movie. This would be my first movie that I've directed, this short documentary.
But you've done 34, 35 other, worked on 34, 35
I've worked
other.
on, 30 to 40 movies as a script supervisor and a production assistant in the industry, other people's movies. So and that's since I've moved to Louisiana. So when over time with John, it just started to make sense. Well, why don't I do a documentary on John?
John, freshman basketball at the Cow Palace was not something that was high on the agenda at that time. What compelled you to go out to the Cow Palace to begin with?
Well, I was actually shooting an awful lot of pictures for LSU at the time because they didn't really have a photographer, and they were kind of leaning on me. It just worked out that way. And the reason why I went out there is because Pete's daddy, when he announced that he was taking the job, said, "Wait till y'all see my kid play basketball."
Whenever you're watching Pete play in those early days, that first game against Southeastern, and you continued obviously to go out, and the crowds got progressively larger to where they eventually, and very soon, if I'm not mistaken, outnumbered anything the varsity was drawing.
Well, they not only outnumbered it, what would happen is that the Cowboys seated about 9,000 people. He quickly became the talk of the town. You got to understand, in a football town where you had 3 seasons, you had football season, you had spring training, you had recruiting. For them to be talking about a freshman basketball player was highly unusual. It turned out that the Cow Barn would be filled for the freshman games. And as soon as the game was over, the varsity would come out and
it would empty?
Almost completely.
Wow.
It was not fair to the varsity, who only won 3 games that year, but still, this was the LSU varsity basketball team, but the star of the show out there had already been ascended.
When you first started watching the Showtime that was Pete Maravich, that everybody became accustomed to throughout the years, you said something to me the other day that you realized right away that there was something deeper and more sincere and special about Pete Maravich in the way he played the game and the way he conducted himself.
Well, yeah, we were talking about the first game he played. He set the standard for what he's going to be doing for the next 3 years at LSU. For 3 straight years, he led the nation in scoring. He's the all-time leading scorer in college basketball. Every year he went up in his points per game average. And he would do it as LSU's number 1 offensive threat, double team, triple team.
No three-point line?
Is good. Oh, no three-point line. But the thing that folks remember Pete for is all his points. But I always thought that the strength of Pete Maravich's game was his passing and his willingness to give the ball up if people would get open. For instance, when we wrote the book, press allowed Pete to stay with Steve Ellis, and I actually put the book together. Steve needs to be mentioned. He's no longer with us, but Steve Ellis and I did it together. And press let Pete come with us for 3 days. Well, he knew Pete and I had kind of gotten, I wouldn't say buddy, but we were pretty close to the same age. So we kind of hit it off really easy. And Pete was the kind of guy who would give the ball up. And even though the points were really important, he got a bigger kick out of making passes to open guys because they would score. And it was not so much I'm going to score all these points and LSU is going to have a superstar scorer. Pete Maravich wanted to win. And he explained to me when we had this time that when he went behind the back, he said, don't get me wrong, I love to hear that crowd go crazy. He loved that. He said, but when I go behind the back, the opponents have been trained to follow the ball. He says, they go after the ball, they fouled me. He said, if I go between my legs, they've been trained to go after the ball. He says, they're out of position. We got a guy open. Pete wanted to win. And it was amazing. You'd watch guys like Bergman and Hickman and Tribbitt and Ralph Euclid just hauling, the guys who were on that team who really don't get enough credit for as hard as they worked during this game. They'd go hustling down the court. Pete always seemed to be in the middle, and they would go hustling down because they knew if he was open that he was going to hit them and they would have a chance to score. Ralph Euclid led the SEC in field goal percentage one year. And Ralph was a fantastic shot from 3 feet away because that's when he would get open and Pete would hit him and he'd lay it in there. It was terrific.
So there was a lot more, Drew, as Mr. John said, to Pete Maravich, to his life, to the substance of who he was. We all know he had a lot of problems in his personal life. What about, we got on about 30 seconds, what about the documentary is so special? Actually, about 5 seconds.
Well, it features John Musemeche, and as you've heard tonight, he's got great stories about Pete.